So thank you all for doing that quick warm up. Hopefully that was review in terms of kind of what you have seen on Canvas, or if not, that was a chance to learn about these 4 steps to what is called this Ready for Rigor framework. So as you may recall from session 1, we talked about inclusive teaching. And when that was discussed, there were a lot of pieces that made up inclusive teaching, and we focused on wise feedback. Today, what we're going to focus on is the Ready for Rigor framework, which was by Zaretta Hammond. She wrote a book called Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. So we're going to take a look at one of these concepts that relates to the 4 steps that are in this Ready for Rigor framework. To start off, we are going to think about this scenario. So I'm going to be talking a lot, so I'd love it if I can get a reader who would be open to just reading this scenario out to the group. Let's see if we can. Let's get Andrea up here. Let's hear a new voice, as there are lots of us, so we want to get everyone's thoughts. Great.
A student was up and out of his seat sharpening his pencil along with other students as the teacher was about to begin the lesson. She got his attention and said, "James, would you like to take your seat?" James said no and continued to sharpen his pencil. The teacher was outraged and sent James to the principal's office. What is happening in this scenario?
Awesome. Thank you, Andrea. So let's unpack the scenario as Andrea read the last question and think about this a little more. So particularly, I want you to think about both of these perspectives. What do you think James's perspective was of this interaction? But also, what do you think the teacher's perspective of this interaction was? So we're going to take about a minute to think about this silently, and then we will share out some of our thoughts. Awesome. So hopefully you got a chance to think about, what are these 2 perspectives in this scenario? So I'd love to start just by, what did you think about from James's perspective? If you were in his shoes, how might you have interpreted this interaction of the question that was asked and the response? If I can find, let's go to Dan. Awesome, and a mic is coming to you, Dan.
Honestly, I don't know, but it's possible he thought it was an honest question. Like, would you like to do it? And he answered it honestly.
Yeah, so in this case, it could have been, all right, you asked me a question. I answered this question. That's that. Awesome. Any other thoughts? Let's go over here. Sorry, yes. And if you could say your name, that'd be great.
Oh, yeah. I'm John, Kamiak High School. James could also be thinking, other people are up. Why is the teacher picking on me?
Yeah, so if you can see the larger context of this situation, if other people are also out of their seats, James might think, why am I being singled out? Awesome, those are great thoughts. Let's think about the other side as well. What about from the teacher? Let's see, any new voices that we can bring into our classroom. All right, you have one, Grace?
I thought I did.
You thought you did?
Yeah, I'm gonna go because I saw his hand raised. And then he put it back down. Sure. But I'm gonna, thank you.
The teacher thinks that they are politely asking someone to take their seat, but they're technically not.
All right, so that might have been, they asked a question and they thought it was a polite response, and that didn't happen. Grace, I'm going to have you go back and give the mic to Michelle, if possible. Thank you.
There's a chance that there could have been patterns of behavior with the same student from other times, so that the teacher automatically assumed this is like a delay tactic to get started in the classroom, and I just want them to sit down, and they're not doing it. But I agree with the other points that first you actually ask what you're asking them to do, to say, please sit down, as opposed to would you like to, because to the first point, in a lot of the culturally responsive background research, they'll say that unless you specifically ask the thing that you're asking, it's not necessarily culturally understood that that's what the question is.
Yeah, that is a really great point. When you're thinking about these, asking if you would like to do it might not get you the response that you want. And in this case, the teacher, as we can see from this scenario, they were outraged. They had this very visceral reaction to his response of no, and sent James to the principal's office. So what we're trying to highlight here is that in this case, this teacher who had this very immediate reaction is exhibiting this concept called the amygdala hijack. So we're gonna dig a little bit into some brain stuff and this concept that all of us can potentially fall folly to. I can do this. So what the amygdala hijack is, well, we're going to watch this video and it will tell you better than I can. We'll see if it works.
When customers are dissatisfied with your service, their feelings can run high. They may have emotional outbursts which seem impossible to deal with. Understanding why people have emotional outbursts can help us control them. Put simply, the amygdala is the emotional centre of the brain and the cortex is the thinking area. In particularly stressful or intense situations, the amygdala takes over the cortex, preparing us for fight or flight, and it makes it difficult for us to use intelligence or reasoning. This is known as the amygdala hijack. During an amygdala hijack, adrenaline is released and stays in the body for about 18 minutes. Here's an example of the amygdala hijack in action. The amygdala hijack is characterized by 3 signs: a strong emotional reaction, a sudden onset, and regretting your actions later. Any strong emotion can trip off the amygdala and impair the cortex's working memory. Rationality is overwhelmed by emotions and stops us from being able to think clearly. If you have an emotional outburst, you can regain control by forcing the thinking part of your brain into action. By labelling your emotions, you can reduce their intensity and return some of the activity back to the cortex, thus increasing cognitive control. The technique of giving assertive feedback is a good way to force the thinking part of your brain to analyse the situation. To do this, you identify how you feel, what is the emotion, about what event or behaviour caused it, and why. Why did that event cause that emotion? Simply identifying these things will help you think rationally about them and help you control the amygdala hijack. Saying these things out loud will let others know how you feel. You can also help others regain control if they are experiencing an amygdala hijack. Just label the emotions you think they are feeling by empathising with them. To empathise with the other person, identify how they feel, what is the emotion, about what event or behaviour caused it, and why. Why did that event cause that emotion? Then say these things out loud to the other person. For example, I can tell you're frustrated, that I was at lunch when you called. I realise you wanted a quick answer. Then pause to let your message sink in and to stop you from saying but. This forces the person to switch on their cortex in order to be able to understand your words. It also reassures them that you have an appreciation of their feelings and situation.
So that's just a quick video on the amygdala hijack. One thing, I've seen this video several times. One thing that I just noticed is, there was that point in, trying to prevent this amygdala hijack where they say, try not to use the word but, but this. And we actually, as a team, did an activity once when we were all together. That was the yes and game. So it's good to, when you're discussing with someone, instead of saying blah, 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 but, because that has, sometimes more negative connotations, you can think of, instead of saying but, you can say yes, and then share your thought. So that was just something that I thought about when I was watching that video with all of you. But as you're thinking about the amygdala hijack, we just watched a pretty short video on it, but here's another way to look at this process. So this graphic just shows what we just saw in the video. The brain is alerted by some external stimuli, and through a process of hormones, different brain processes that triggers the emotional brain to take over, and your thinking brain kind of takes a back seat. Something that's interesting that was mentioned in the video and that's on this slide is that it can take on average about 20 minutes for your thinking brain to really come back into play. And if you're in a 50-minute class, that's about half the time that you're in the class. So as you're thinking about this process, you really want to be thinking about how can I prevent or alleviate these amygdala hijacks. So we're going to dig into next some of the ways that amygdala hijack might occur. So in Zaretta Hammond's book, she says there are 5 threats that can cause this amygdala hijack. And they can happen in unexpected situations, so it's good to think of all 5 of these as you're planning, as you're going through your class. We're going to quickly talk about each one, and the first is the threat to one's standing. So you can see here, this is the fear of diminishing status within a group or being expelled from a tribe. So you can think of comparisons between students, how you're compared to your peers or if you're other students. You can think about assessments or evaluations at work. You may get evaluated, and that can cause a threat to one's standing. The next one is a threat to one's sense of certainty. So your understanding, your knowledge base, a threat to kind of what you know. And we'll talk about it later, this sense of failure. But as many of you are engineers, you'll know when you write code, it doesn't always work the first time, and you have to kind of deal with that failure and be okay with iterating and going through that. But that can be really challenging. Those mistakes and failure can cause a threat to your certainty and cause an amygdala hijack. Also with new ideas, learning something new that can make someone freeze, make someone have that emotional response. Next is threat to one's connections. If you remember back in high school, being in your group, having a place is very important. So when your connections are threatened, thinking about group work or thinking about taking social risks, that can cause a very visceral reaction. So thinking about your connections when you're in the classroom or when you're at work is something that can cause an amygdala hijack. Next is threat to one's sense of control. This one is pretty straightforward. When you don't have that control over your choices, over what you're going to do, that can cause this amygdala hijack. Being told, like, you have to do it this way or else. Like, you cannot do anything, you cannot do this process any other way. That can threaten a student's sense of control over how they can process this information. And then lastly, we have a threat to one's sense of equity. And this one's interesting because there are two sides of this coin. There's this case where you might feel that you're treated unfairly, and that would be a threat to your sense of equity. But there's also a threat to your sense of equity when you may feel that you are being involved in an unfair system. Maybe you have some perceived favoritism. Other people are being disadvantaged while you are being advantaged. That can also be a threat to one's sense of equity and cause this amygdala hijack. So I know we went through those pretty quickly, and I gave a few examples, but I'm sure as you were sitting listening to me, and even as I was saying this, I can think of many examples in school, but also in work, also in just your life, that these threats may come up that you might not think of them right away. But as you're in the classroom working with these students, you'll want to think about these as you're planning for your lessons, as you're thinking about what techniques am I going to use? How am I going to assign this work? So that you can alleviate the chance of causing these amygdala hijacks and having students just shut down. This is another example of how an amygdala hijack can happen. And you might remember, well, hopefully you do, we talked about the cold call informative assessment. And we talked about how asking the question and then just calling on someone, that can be terrifying for a student. I would hate that. I would probably have an amygdala hijack for many reasons. A threat to my equity. Why am I being called out? I think someone brought that up as well in the previous scenario. Maybe James felt the one kind of singled out. So it might, just being called on right after asking a question, that might be a threat to your equity. It might be a threat to your certainty. If you aren't sure of the answer, you were just suddenly called on and are expected to answer this question. You can think of, there are multiple ways to view these scenarios. It's hard to think about all of them, but the fact that you are even thinking about them is helping you get closer to ensuring that you're not causing these situations to occur. So now that we know that this can happen, it can happen at any point, we want to think about what are some ways to prevent or alleviate this amygdala hijack. So in the video that we watched, they gave those 3 steps of labeling your feelings, giving a reason why. I'm forgetting the second step. But you can see that this soda method is very similar to what was discussed in the video. And we can see, the first step is to stop. So stop what you're doing. Make sure that you don't just immediately make that decision to send the student out of the classroom or yell or what have you. O is for observe. So take a time to breathe, to pause. Do that, count from 10 backwards so that you can just observe what is happening. Next is detach. So detach yourself from, in this case, the need to be right sometimes. So try to step out of your body and think about, okay, I feel this anger, this what have you, but let me take a pause to step out of that. And then lastly is awaken empathy. So think about the other players in this situation. How might they be feeling? Put yourself in their shoes and think about, okay, from their perspective, how might they be perceiving this interaction? So this will help you, fully decompress and prevent some of these amygdala hijacks or, prevent them from lasting so long. So this is great to bring into the classroom. It's also great to teach your students. They'll be in classes all day long in different scenarios. There are chances that their amygdala will be hijacked in various points throughout the day. So if they have these steps as well, they can also help prevent this amygdala hijack and really think about or focus on the thinking parts and allow them to think creatively and use their higher order thinking skills. There's some other ways that you, in particular, when you're in the classroom, can think about creating this inclusive class, preventing this amygdala hijack, comes down to the way that you're presenting. So the first piece that we'll talk about is your tone of voice. So you can see you want to be compassionate, you want to be friendly, but you don't want to be their friend. You still have authority. So it's a very fine line that you're trying to walk when you're working with your students. You want to be open and approachable, but you're not their best friend. You're not their sibling. They can't come to you with everything because you are, working with the teacher, still instructing this class. And you also want to be engaging. You can't just have a monotone voice. You can't be really quiet. So there are a lot of components to your voice that you want to think about as you're presenting or even as you're working with a student. You can see that we all have different styles of tone, and that hopefully seeing these varied tones will help you see, hopefully it'll help some learn better than others depending on who is up in front. You see we vary them so that you're getting these different perspectives as we're going through this training, which is a long day, and that's why there's many of us. Next is body language, and this is really important for a lot of our in-person schools, but also even for our remote schools. So can I just get some shout outs of what emotions do you think this person who's pointing, what do you think she is conveying? What kind of emotions? Just shout them out. I heard annoyance, I heard anger, accusatory, disrespect. What about the ones with her hands arms crossed over her arms? I heard not listening, shut down. I heard closed off. Right, so generally, close off. And what about the last one with her arms on her hips, hands on her hips? Right, I heard I'm right. I heard disappointed, frustrated. Right, so we can see, these, just by changing your body language, there are different emotions that are conveyed. And what's interesting is when we take away the body language, we can see that this person's face, her face, is very similar in all of these three images. And even the one in the middle, her chin is slightly tilted down. And that can sometimes convey a disapproving look just by that slight tilt of her chin. So these are another important thing to think about when you're talking, when you're instructing in both classes, in your in-person and in remote classes, is how you're presenting yourself can relay different emotions to your students. All right, and then the last component to talk about is word choice. So you can see in this first column we have a few different phrases that you might hear in the workplace, you might use with other adults. Something like, that's wrong, fix it, here's a better way to do things. But when you're thinking about working with students, especially students that may be learning computer science for the first time, you'll want to think about using a softer language. So instead of saying that's wrong, you might say that's not quite right, or saying who's not done yet. If I ask you who's not done yet, you probably don't want to be the person who raises their hand and is like, yeah, I'm not done yet. So you instead maybe you want to say like, who still needs more time, or who's still working. I think another interesting one is, raise your hand if you don't get it. How many of you want to raise your hand because you don't get this concept? I totally do. I want to be like, I don't get it. I need help. I might be the only one. So you want to think about, the way that you phrase some of these, techniques to figure out where your students are at, so that they are in a softer, more, positive light. In this case, we had one suggestion of raise your hand if you'd like to hear that again. If you'd like to hear another example. And this is really where our volunteers can also step in to provide those additional perspectives and ways to explain this material. All right, so that was a lot of me talking about different ways that we can think about creating this inclusive space. So now it's your turn to think about how might you respond to some of these scenarios you'll see in the class. So what you're going to do is we're going to take a look at our activity packet and we are going to pair up. So I said that out of order. Let's first pair up and then take a look at our activity packet. So make sure that you have someone you can work with. If we have an odd number, feel free to get into a group of 3. That is fine as well. And then once you've found your pair, please do bring your attention back up here so I know that you've found a friend to do this next activity with. All right. So I think most people, I hear some talk already, which is great. Most people, it looks like, has found someone to work with. Again, if you don't have someone right next to you, feel free to just join a group of 2. But what you're going to be doing before I let you go on this activity is you will find on page 7 of your activity packet that we have a few scenarios, just brief lines that you might hear from your students. And with those is an emotional tone that you might, again, hear from your students. So what you're going to do is you're going to start at the first one, and you're going to choose one person to be the student and one person to be the volunteer or classroom teacher. And as a student, you're going to start out this interaction by saying that phrase with that tone of voice to your volunteer or classroom teacher. Then it is the job of the volunteer or classroom teacher to respond to that, thinking of these components that we just talked about, your tone of voice, your body language, your word choice, that SOTA acronym. You want to think about all those concepts, how they can come into play in these interactions. Once you've done the first one, you'll swap and do the next phrase. And we're going to take about 5 minutes to do this, and then we'll regroup after. Awesome. All right. So how was that? Thumbs up if you had fun. Thumbs down if it was like, why am I doing this? Okay. Hopefully it was okay. Hopefully there were some interesting ones, and we're going to just call on a few folks to share an interesting interaction that they had, something that you thought would be beneficial to hear from a volunteer or classroom teacher. So we're going to do some random calling. Let's see. Oh, there's one. It's blank. Someone got away. The anonymous person, yes. All right, Andrew. Yes, and a mic. Andrew McGolash? Is that how you say it? Your mic is coming to you. Right there, yeah, sorry about that.
So for the second one with apathy, we were talking about how a lot of times it could be that the student isn't motivated because of kind of external forces outside of the class. And so to some extent, there's not much, I mean, we can't really do anything about the outside circumstances, but if you can kind of try and relate the current material to something more engaging with something they might be interested in their lives, that could be a way to kind of get them motivated a bit more and more interested in the subject.
Yeah, so really, there can be external factors at play. So again, it comes back to that point that I think all of us are making of, it is so important to get to know your students, get to know their interests and what they like, what they don't like, and find ways that you can bring that into the classroom so that you can really engage that material in what they're excited about. Awesome. Next, can we get Robert? Robert Palmer. There he is. All right. Kit is making his way to you.
So I liked one of the things Lauren said, number 4, can you change my grade? And she didn't just let me off the hook right away. Let's talk about what you did. Can you explain it to me? Can you demonstrate to me in another way that you understand the material? And then we can talk about your grade.
Awesome. Yeah, and we'll actually get to a whole section on grading later today and some of the techniques that you can use there. Awesome. Thank you. And lastly, can I get Greg Palmer? Yes. Thank you, Kate. You're definitely getting in your steps.
I think we all enjoyed the role playing. At least I did for the kids. But yeah, I think with the Defiant, I think we both thought that we were going to be getting a lot of kids who might not necessarily want to be in this class, but it was one of only a couple options that they needed to do one of them. So I think the kind of relating and being in a similar situation and having that be a starting point to figuring out how to kind of get through this together.
Yeah, so definitely this sort of class will be a great time to get to know your students, get to know their motivation for the class if they have any, or again, that kind of learning period to ensure that their interests are brought into the class as you create this environment for them to learn in. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. We have one more slide to talk about for creating an inclusive classroom. This is around school norms. So there are a lot of policies that the school may have. There are written and unwritten rules that may be at the school, and those are certainly things that you want to discuss with your classroom teacher. So you can see we just have a few here. We have the dress code, or how you may or may not want to use social media. Not having any physical contact. I think that is across the board something we would recommend. You probably do not want to touch the students unless you kind of discuss what that process is in any way. But you can see, also just modeling professionalism of being prepared, coming to the class on time, things that you want to see your students learn. Those are great for you to model as well. So you can see there are a lot of different norms that, in creating this classroom environment that you want to think about and really discuss with your teacher, with your teaching team as you're building out your plan this summer and as you get into the school year.